Okay, so now I'd like to highlight two major philosophies in software development. First, I should say neither is right or wrong. They each have their place, and knowing when to use which is important. The historic software development process, and by historic I mean, ever since software was first written, going back, 50, 60, 70 years ago, was waterfall. And more recently, companies have started adopting agile software development, and there's been a lot of excitement around agile. And some people have taken it to the extreme and assume that every software system should be agile development. I don't think that's appropriate. I think there are lots of applications where waterfall still makes sense, but it's important to know which is which. So, for example, some differences between the two. Waterfall software development is for really large systems. Agile is much more appropriate for very small systems. Waterfall typically uses a team that is onshore, close to the customer, close to the needs, usually in a high-cost geography, coupled with an offshore team that is much larger, and they're writing the actual code, and that offshore team is lower cost. The Agile team is, because it's small, it's usually co-located. It's 5 people, it's 10 people. It might be 15 people, but not much more. So when you have, a 100-person software development team, it's very difficult to be Agile. Waterfall software development usually takes a long time to develop it. It's measured in months, sometimes quarters, sometimes years. Hopefully not years. Agile is measured in weeks or sometimes days. Rarely is it measured in hours, but in some cases even hours. The waterfall method has a well-defined outcome. Before you start writing code, you know what the outcome is going to look like. In Agile, you really don't know what the outcome is going to look like. Instead, you set a time limit and you do as much as you can inside that time limit. Waterfall is good for systems that are highly integrated and complex. Agile is good for systems that are much simpler and modular, and I'll give you some examples in a few minutes on what that is. Waterfall systems are really important for mission critical applications. So you might think of banking software. You really don't want banking software to trial and error, if you will, right? But that's precisely what Agile does. So Agile is much more launch it, see what works, see what doesn't work, tune it, and we'll make it better as we go. That's not something you want with your banking software. That's not something you want with, say, your air traffic control system for an airport. And your enterprise resource planning or ERP system is typically in the mission critical side, not something you want to play with and tune and trial and error as you go. Waterfall, because it has those planned outcomes, it has contracted features. You know what the success criteria is. Agile tends to be, we'll get what we get and we'll try to put in as much as we can. So Agile tends to be less well-defined. Similarly, in terms of documentation, the waterfall system has good documentation, so it's easy for whoever comes behind to improve the software, where Agile might not have any documentation or very little documentation. You document it as you go, and just minimal at best. The waterfall system also has a really robust validation process. You test everything and make sure everything is working before you hit release. Agile, you tend to release and then fix, release and then fix. In waterfall, you're only going to spend about 10% of your time actually writing code. You're going to spend 90% of your time on all the planning, frankly, and testing that goes into that. Conversely, with Agile, you're going to spend about 70% of your time writing code, and as you write code, you're going to learn and change things. So there's a big difference in this small team in Agile and how much of that small team's time is spent writing code versus the large team in Waterfall and how much of that team is spent, how much of the time of that team is spent writing code. The the next big difference, the final big difference between waterfall and agile is that the user acceptance testing, that's UAT, is defined up front. So with waterfall, you know exactly what the test criteria are to pass or fail. With Agile, you really don't know what the criteria are, but you have the customer sitting on the team. So this small team of 10 or 15 at the most has one of those people being the customer, and the customer is providing real-time feedback as the code is being written. So in Waterfall, I mentioned that only 10% of your time is in construction. So what are you doing the rest of the time? Well, the first thing you have to do is define the project. What are we here to do? What is this software meant to accomplish? Then you have to go gather a whole bunch of requirements. Well, if it's meant to accomplish that, what needs to happen in order for this software to work? And then you get into detailed analysis, and the detailed analysis gets down to which field and which system needs to talk to which field and which system, and which format are we going to be using, and that starts to lead into a design of your new solution. So your analysis looks at how much data is transmitting. Is it transmitting on a frequent basis or an infrequent basis? What are the confirmations of the data that it's been received correctly and transmitted correctly from system to system or from field to field? And then you start to architect your design. Only then do you actually spend time in construction, and that's, like I said, for Waterfall, it's only about 10% of your total time in construction. And then you spend a lot of time in testing. After you've tested it thoroughly, you can implement it. And after it's been implemented, there's even a lot of time spent post-implementation supporting it. Okay, so let's say, for example, we're going to make a waterfall solution, and we're going to pick, I picked Portland, Oregon, driving to Boston, Massachusetts, but it could be any point A to B inside the continental United States. So we're going to write a software tool using the waterfall method to calculate the speed someone should use to drive from any point in the United States to any other point in the United States. So we need to spend some time gathering, defining the project. I think I defined most of it just there. Gathering all the requirements. So let's see. Well, the first requirement is we need to know every road in America. So we need to build a database of every road in America. We also need to know the speed limit for every road in America. We also need to know when construction is occurring. So we need to tap into the Department of Transportation for every state in the lower 48. We need to know weather conditions, so we need to tap into some weather apps, and we also need to know fuel usage, so we need a database of every vehicle and what its optimal fuel usage is by speed. As you can start to see, this is a massive task. And if we were to attempt to do this, we would almost certainly fail. A few years ago, healthcare.gov attempted to do something just like what I'm describing. They attempted to create one of the world's largest software systems for healthcare in this particular case, but one of the world's largest software systems in general. And they attempted to use the waterfall method, and it failed. It failed brilliantly. You might remember that it had to be released and released again a second time, a third time, and fixed. And through that crisis, a lot of people went to software development experts in the Bay Area, who the Amazons, the Googles, the Yahoos of the world, and Facebooks of the world, and said, "How would you have done this differently?" And the first thing they said is, well, we would not have used the waterfall method. We would have used an agile method. And the result would be we would have launched something, it wouldn't have been very good, and then we would have made it better, and that wouldn't have been very good, and we'd make it better, and we'd make it better, but we'd make them better in a really quick way, and within a short period of time, you'd finally have the solution you need. And the problem with that for healthcare.gov is that because it's a government project, it has a budget and it has a predefined contract. So you can just imagine the U.S. government saying, hey, we're going to launch healthcare.gov, and we've picked a software provider, and we'll get what we get, but it'll be done in 30 days. And we're not sure if it's going to work, and we're not sure how many times we're going to have to iterate it, but we'll just play it by ear. That just doesn't work for a government entity, and it doesn't work for a government procurement process. So a system as big as healthcare.gov and paid for by taxpayer dollars just could not become an agile solution. It had to be waterfall, and by making it waterfall, it created a massively large project with complexities that could not be foreseen, and that is the root cause for why it did not succeed on its first launch. All right, we'll come back in just a moment to talk about Agile.